Man, it's been a good day already. I'm excited to be back. It's good to be home. Some of you, if I haven't met you yet, my name's Steve Rowland. I'm the senior pastor here at Rising Sun. I look forward to maybe meeting you after service and just kind of getting to know a little bit more about your story. Those of you who are part of our family here at Rising Sun, you know that my wife and I, we were able to go on vacation. If you could turn the house lights down just a touch so people could see this. Jerry, if you want to scroll back through it after they're through, that's fine too. But many of you who are familiar to what's going on here at Rising Sun, my wife and I had an opportunity to go to Alaska recently. We left 2 weeks ago, and I brought back some pictures just so that you guys can kind of see what we saw. And we had, I'll tell you what, the trip of a lifetime. On so many different levels, we saw things that may not be there by the time maybe another 10, 20, 30 years as I age. And so for me to share this experience with my son and with my wife, it was just breathtaking, to say the least, and actually beyond words, beyond description. But we saw wildlife like you wouldn't believe. We saw porcupines, we saw eagles, we saw bears, black bears, grizzly bears with cubs. We saw buffalo. As you're driving the Alcan highway, buffalo just stand right in the middle of the road. They call it the Alaskan speed bump, which I didn't know until we got there. But it's so true. You're just driving along, and all of a sudden, hey, there's a buffalo right in the middle of the road. And these are just free-range buffalo, just like you would find at Neil Smith, except for that there's no Neil Smith cage. We saw about 75 to 100 buffalo. And we saw just all kinds of just neat things that are beyond description. But the wildlife certainly is something that I connected with. We saw moose. We saw mountains and rivers. Anytime that there was a mountain or a river right next to each other, I just handed Evan the phone in the back, and he just took like 30,000 pictures. I need a new memory card on my phone now. But there were all kinds of neat things. We went to Laird Springs. If you ever get a chance to go to Laird Springs, Canada, it's a hot spring. That's something that Mandy and I, in the last year or two, have started to kind of understand more about our world that we didn't know before, is that there are these hot springs in the world, just kind of geographically randomly put, and they're sulfuric, and they smell like rotten eggs. But when you get in this hot water, it's just like getting in a hot tub. And there was, as you went further to the source, the sulfuric acid became, or the sulfuric aroma became more apparent, but also the water became hotter. It was about 30 to 40 degrees hotter than a normal hot tub, and it was almost unbearable. And the rocks were just pure white. Another couple of things that we saw just along the trip that I thought was just insane, never thought I'd be able to do this in my life, is go salmon fishing with Evan. And we went in on low tide, so as the tide is coming in, Evan started hand fishing salmon, which I don't know is illegal. I don't think it's legal, but we didn't have anywhere in there to tell us no, so we continued to do that. I did catch a couple with the rod and reel, and he caught some with the rod and reel, and that was just, again, wow. I mean, how in the world? I told Mandy on the way up, there was one night when the sun was setting, and it was, sun was setting at 1 a.m. or something to that effect, because it's up north Alaska, Canada. I said, God's showing off up here. That's all he's doing, is just showing off. And us being in the concrete jungle of Des Moines and urban, we miss that. We miss some of the just natural scenery that God does. So I love going out. We were able to go hiking for 2.5 miles up a mountain, and then rode a tram for 2 minutes down that same mountain. That seemed unfair. I went. Not only did I go king salmon fishing, but we went king crabbing, and you could see the picture up there. But Mandy and I, it was a little too cold for Evan because the waters are glacier waters. They're ice cold, and so he stayed back, and Mandy and I went out and we went fishing for crab, and we caught this pink fish that, as you touch it, it just felt like a ball of jelly, but then you can see through about 2 inches in its body, and you see this meat that's there. It was the weirdest fish I've ever seen. Our personal guides said they've only seen the fish 3 times. We saw a starfish in the cage. We caught king crab, and as soon as we caught the crab, we kept the same water that we caught him in. And then we went back to Uncle Randy's house, and he steamed them up for us. 20 minutes later, we're eating king crab right out of the ocean. I'll tell you. Oh, wow. Yeah, I know I'm making all of you jealous, and that's not my goal. It really isn't. But this was, what you're seeing here is some of the neatest stuff. It's the ice glaciers of Mendenhall, and they are rapidly rescinding. I would encourage all of you to YouTube the Mendenhall ice glaciers in Alaska and see the time lapse that's happened in the last, 10 years or so. But you can kayak about 5 miles on frozen water, and I was given the inflatable raft, which was not a good idea. I don't know how we made it to this day, but we ended up making it, and Evan and I were in the same boat. We get to the ice glaciers, and then you have to hike about 350 yards uphill to these glaciers, and as you walk in these glaciers, they're just ice caves. A lot of these pictures, you think they're Photoshopped, but they're not. I mean, this is us standing in the ice glacier. And that's Evan there. That water that's coming off, we filled our canteens with. It was some high quality H2O. I'll tell you what, man, it was good stuff. But the whole trip, as we built memories with Evan, I want you to hear, and I don't want to lose the opportunity to maybe encourage you in something that I've stumbled into, that Mandy and I've stumbled into the last 20 years of marriage. We had decided, I think Madison and Joe, I think they were like 8, 9, 10 years old in that area of life, that we needed to really invest in our children. And so we started to develop this strategy, and I decided to take them down home and let them see my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather's tombstone. Now, I was taken here as a kid, and it was Augustus Wessel and other tombstones along the way, but basically what I did was, with that trip, share with them who they are and where they come from, and we spoke a lot about identity. What it means to be a man, and what it means to be a woman, and what it means to be a child is what we did in that very first trip. And then the second trip that we've decided to take with our children is when they're about 11 or 12, and that's why Evan got to go with us instead of all of them. This was his 11 or 12-year-old trip. And what we talk about there is just sexual purity and what it means to have some guardrails in our life when it comes to our sexual identities and who we are sexually and how we can glorify God in that way. We used Passport to Purity, which you can check out in Home Point. There's some incredible resources that just give moms and dads some easy, practical, simple conversation tools where they're able to have these dialogues that sometimes can be awkward with your son or daughter. And so we use this trip as the sexual purity trip with Evan. 2 of our kids have already gone through the third trip, and the third trip is, we've already dealt with who they are, where they come from, and sexual purity, but the third trip is where they are. We strategically, Mandy and I have decided we're going to launch our children when they're 16 years old. So as soon as they get to 16, we start to kind of step back and say, all right, figure it out. No curfews, no boundaries. It's going to happen eventually. We will lose influence over our children. And a lot of times those influence times are when they're 18, 19, 20 years old. It's when they go off to high school or they go off to college. And when that happens, moms and dads, I've seen this through the 20 years of ministry or so, moms and dads have this instinctive desire to hold tight to those areas of influence. And in doing so, sons and daughters, what do? They actually rebel against that authority. And so Mandy and I decided a long time ago that 16 would be the time that we started to let go of our children. Because they're not ours. When our children were born, one of the prayers that we had is that, God, these are your children, not ours. We're simply stewards of what you've given us. And so I don't have the same filter and perspective that I find a lot of my peers and comrades and brothers and sisters have, where what son and daughter do is a reflection of mom and dad. That I feel like that's their life. I've been given a responsibility to coach them along the way and to let them go, to release them. That's my job. So we've decided strategically to release them at 16, but at the Where You Are trip, when they're about 15 years old, we identify the strengths that they've inherited from us, the weaknesses that they've inherited from us, because we're not perfect. We see mere reflections of our children every day. We see the flaws, and sometimes they're accented. And it's bothersome as a dad to see that they've been given the same things that I struggle with. So at 15, we identify some of those strengths and weaknesses, and we say, here are the things that we see that God wants to do in your life, so now go do. We want to help identify them, but go do. So where they are. The fourth trip that we're going to take with our children is where they're going. And this is going to be sometime, none of the kids have had this yet, but this is going to be sometime when they're 18, 19, 20 years old, and they're trying to figure out life, and we're going to help guide them and project them into what we call this world. As we release them, one of my favorite verses in all of the Bible is Psalm 124, verse 6, and it says, like arrows in the hands of a mighty warrior are children of a man's youth. Stop and think about that. That's written in Psalm. That's 1000 BC. They didn't just go to Bass Pro or Gander Mountain and buy a dozen arrows. They made the shafts, they knapped the flint, they shaped the steel, they knocked the arrow, they practiced with that arrow, so by the time the warrior went out into battle, he drew that arrow back. He knew where that arrow was going to go because he's practiced with the arrow. It took time. Being a parent takes a lot of time and a lot of work, doesn't it? So we decided that we're going to release them. That's our role. And as we launch them into this world, it will be where they're going. And then the fifth trip that we're going to take with our children is before they get married. And that might not ever happen. But if they ever choose to get married, we're going to speak to them about the things that we've learned about what it means to be a husband or a wife. And right before they have children, the last trip that we intend to take with our children is the lessons that we've learned about what it means to be a father and a mother. So this was more than just an Alaskan crusade for us. There was some purpose, but really the best part of the whole trip, yeah, we saw some pretty cool wildlife and different things, but the best part of the whole trip for us was something that we didn't even plan for. We got into Alberta, just crossed through British Columbia, and there's this little town called Fort Nelson, and it's when the mountains start to climb, and the rig that we had is my wife's cousin bought a vehicle and a camper and asked us to bring it up there, and that's how we actually ended up there. But the vehicle that she bought really didn't have I didn't think, the best power, right? Guys, you're with me. Okay, when you're pulling a camper through the mountains, you want some assurance that you're going to make it. You don't want to go, oh, I'm not sure this is going to work. As soon as I saw the vehicle, I went, oh, I'm not sure this is going to work. So it's a little Dodge Durango, 4.7 motor, and as we're pulling through the mountains, I was being careful with the vehicle, but I tacked it out to 4,000 RPMs, which isn't a huge deal when you're going through the mountains, but I had done that, and as I did it, it zipped. It went zing, and I went, oh no, I lost my transmission. And it was in the middle of the night. We had just seen our bears. The thunderstorm had just happened. We're an hour and a half on the north side of any civilization and 40 miles from any civilization to the north of us. So we're kind of in the middle of no man's land. We had just seen 6 or 7 vehicles go by, and inside I'm freaking out because I'm thinking, oh no, I lost my tranny. I've got my family with me. We're going to end up dying here, and you guys are going to be left with Dylan. Just kidding. I watched the sermon last week, and I thought that Dylan did a really nice job. I'm very happy. I love how Dylan's able to bring the truths of Scripture into his real life, and I thought he did a really nice job as we introduced the way. When Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. What does the way mean? And I thought he did a really nice job there. But the best part of the whole trip, though, for me was when we broke down, we were able to see, I was able to show Evan how not to freak out in a stressful situation. Because inside, I'm going, well, we're going to die. There's no doubt about it. We're going to die here. But outwardly, I can't portray that to my wife because then that'll get worse. And I certainly can't portray it to Evan because that'll be even worse than Mandy. So I said, you know what? This is going to be okay. We're good. Well, what are you going to do? Well, we're just going to sit here and wait. We'll be fine. 1 vehicle, 2 vehicle, 3 vehicle, 5 vehicles, 17 vehicles by later. And then I decided, well, let's start the vehicle. Maybe the trainees had enough time to cool off, and I did, and I put it in second. We crept 40 miles at 25 miles an hour, and we were able to come into town at Fort Nelson, and God was with us. It was amazing because Daleks Auto Salvage, man, they are a godsend. I mean, they are the best mechanic on that entire stretch, and we parked right next to them that night when we came in. And they were able to diagnose it as just being a throttle position sensor. Of course, they didn't have one in the auto parts store for our vehicle, so we had to wait a day. But then as the part came in, it was a quick snap, and we were on our way. And we met our ferry. We were able to be on time. But it was during that moment where I said, you watch, Evan. This is what we didn't plan for, but this is going to be the best part of our whole trip. And outside of everything that we experienced, the wildlife, the experiences, it was that time when God just said, be still. You're going so quick that you're missing it. Stop. And sometimes in our life, God does that, I believe, in our journey. He makes us stay. He makes us stop when there's nothing that you can do but just sit down and go, now what? Nope, just sit there. Just wait. Be still. Know that I'm God, Psalm 46:10. And that's what it ended up being. Fort Nelson was a beautiful little town. It had the best organic store in the world, in my opinion, bar none to anything that we've ever experienced in Des Moines. A lot of you know that my wife is a food critic and food Nazi. Pray for me. Okay. She loves that organic thing, and it was the best store in the world, I think. The coffee was amazing. It was fresh. I don't know how they did it fresh. The best mechanic in the world. They had an awesome water park, and we were able just to chill and just be with each other instead of run to our destination, trying to meet the schedule, trying to meet the deadline. And as we've come back, I've asked Evan, what's the best part of your trip? Fort Nelson. Why? Because we had to stop. Capitalize on those opportunities. It's in those moments where inside you're freaking out in life, and it's because outside everything is chaos. And it's in those moments where all you want to do is go home, find your bed, crawl in bed, and just pretend the boogeyman's not there, that God shows up. And that's a lesson that I was reminded of because there's something bigger going on. The question is, do we miss that something bigger? I was able to meet all kinds of people all over the world, which I thought was just amazing. I actually bought my fishing license in Alaska from a lady in northeast Iowa. She's just graduated high school, and she went up there just to spend the summer, and she was at Gander Mountain and bought her my fishing license. She said, so you're from Iowa? Yeah, where are you from? Northeast Iowa. Oh, how long you been here? 2 months. That's weird. Never thought I'd buy my Alaskan fishing license from a lady in Iowa, in Alaska. But I had, not only did I meet this lady who sold me my fishing license, I met this guy by the name of Mark who's in corporate America. We spoke about leadership. And through those conversations and even conversations with family, we were able to talk about faith and love and truth and resurrection and Bible. And I cast seeds. I was able to hang out with people who are not ordinarily church people. And I loved it. I got to be real. Because they didn't know that I was a pastor. In fact, if I told them I was a pastor, they would have thought I was nuts. And as we spoke and as we talked about faith, some of the questions that I heard are common questions that you hear. How can we really know? How can we really be sure? How can we see God? How can we trust the Bible? One of my favorite questions was, how do we know what is true and what isn't true? And I'll reserve who shared that with me, but that was the number one question that I got. That was my favorite question and conversation of the entire trip, is how can we know what is truth? And I remember having this conversation, and I went into this dialogue about, if there is no definition of truth, then there cannot be any line. And if there's no line that divides truth from lie, right from wrong, good from bad, then we can do whatever we want. And I don't know why this illustration hit me in this moment, but I've never thought of this illustration before. But we love the Pirates of the Caribbean series with Jack Sparrow and different things. But do you remember Jack's compass? Remember what Jack's compass points Jack to in the whole series through the movies? Yeah, his desires. His compass doesn't point north. It doesn't tell him where he is against the north line. It tells him what he wants all the time. And it just instantly, I was like, this describes our culture. This is us. Each one of us have our own Jack's compass, and that's what we think life tells us. We think that as long as, like, my north is whatever my north wants it to be, and you have no right to tell me what my north is, what my truth is, what my north and south, what my right and wrong, what my truth and lie is. It's whatever I want it to be, and it really kind of describes all of culture. Isn't that interesting? Is that really true, though? You see, in our culture, I know that truth is questioned, but I also believe that truth is also polarizing. Because if we can remove the line, and if we can make it about relative truth and do whatever we want to in life, that works up to a point. But the second that your truth collides with my truth and it interferes with what I want to do in life or what I'm chasing in life, all of a sudden we have a problem. Because relative truth only works up to a point, but it's relative justice that none of us would be okay with. Have you ever thought about that? That is the second that you collide with my truth, you're wrong. Well, who's to say you're wrong if there is no wrong? But see, the thing about truth is not only is it questioned, but it's also polarizing. It's something that divides us through and through. A couple of months ago, I was just scrolling through the news, and some of you may be aware of this, some of you may not, but there's this politician by the name of Russell Vought, and Russell Vought was nominated by Donald Trump to sit on a committee, the finance committee in D.C. And as he was being vetted and interviewed, Bernie Sanders approaches him and he said, earlier you had written a piece about how Muslims are blind, they stand condemned, their faith is incomplete because they don't believe Jesus is who he said he was. Do you really believe that? Bernie asks this Russell Vought guy. And Russell Vought goes into this rhetoric about how he's a Christian, he was writing for his alma mater, and he was trying to defend his school's position. And Bernie attacks this Christian. He says, are you telling me that every Muslim who are in the United States, I think there's 2 million Muslims, you guys can check out this video. I think there's about 2 million Muslims. Are you telling me and telling all of us that they stand condemned, Russell? Well, I am a Christian, sir, and I was writing this piece based on my virtues. And what he was referring to is the passage that Dylan introduced last week. When Jesus said perhaps one of the most audacious claims in all of the Bible. He said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one will come to the Father except through me. Are you saying that Muslims are condemned? Let's take it from the top down, because this is really kind of a simple question, right? There's either a yes, God exists, or no, God does not exist. Those are our options on the table. Would everyone agree to at least that fact? Either God exists or God does not exist. Can I get a vote of affirmation on that one? Okay. I'm not asking you which one you believe. I'm saying those are really the only two options on the table. In every world religion, Buddhism, Christianity, Muslim, Zen, all of them, they say there is some higher power, there's something called deity, there's something called God. Those world religions endorse the idea that God is. But if you're an agnostic or an atheist, then you would land on the camp that no, God is not. Those are really your only options. But both cannot be right at the same time, can they? Either one is right and one is wrong. Either you're going to hedge your bets on one being truth and one being a lie. So some of our population are living a lie. Some of our population are living a truth. But then when you dissect it even further, and now let's just examine all the world religions for a second. Okay? Islam, Christianity, Buddhism, just keep naming them, as many as you want. I would say all of the religions that say that there is a God, most of them agree to 2 points. Those 2 points are, God created us, and we messed up. Now, they call that messing up something completely different, depending on which faith you want to align yourself with. But most of them would say, God is, right? God created, and we are. And we're in this chasm trying to get to God. That's where most faiths agree. But then Christianity stands alone from every other faith in its claim. Every other faith would not suggest that God came to earth to show us the way. They just say we have to get to God, sometimes figuring it out. In fact, if you press your Muslim friends or your Muslim neighbors or the Islamic faith at all, what you'll find is they do not believe that Jesus can be from God. They do not believe he can be the Son of God. He cannot be God himself. Let alone, they do not believe that Jesus died on the cross. But then if you take it even just one step further, what makes us so weird, according to the world, is that we believe in a risen Savior, in a Savior that broke the chains of death. There is no other faith, Confucius, Muhammad, all the other pioneers of faith, when it comes right down to their death, their story ends. It's only one faith where the proclaimer of its faith, the originator of its faith, says, I'm going to do something about man's biggest problem. That's death. And he broke the grave open. That's what stands Christianity alone from everything else. Now, here, go back to your earlier arguments. All can't be right. One has to be right. But it's polarizing, isn't it? It creates a line in the sand, and you either are in or you are out. The question for all of us today is, which side of the line are you on? See, I believe not only does truth polarize us cognitively in our understanding, in our intellect, but I also believe that it polarizes us emotionally. Remember earlier when I referred to this Russell vote and Bernie Sanders, immediately there was some emotional responses that happened in your head, didn't you? Because we went into some political arenas. Some of you went, oh no, what's he going to say? What's he going to do? Right? Because emotionally, truth divides. Truth cuts. And it's in those moments of your thickest tensions where I believe that God wants to come in and cut the tension in half. I believe there is a line. I believe that line is truth, and it divides what is true from what is false, what is right from what is wrong, what is good from what is bad. But if there is a line, then what that means is that we have a reference point, because imagine me going to Canada without knowing which way is north. Imagine trying to be able to read an atlas or a map without knowing that there's a constant. See, there has to be constant in our world. 2 + 2 is always 4. You don't get to just decide and determine based on how you feel how old you are, right? I feel like I'm 65. I'm going to go retire now. They would laugh me off the court steps. Why? Because it doesn't work that way. There either is or there is not. There's no other way. I want you to turn your Bibles to John chapter 14, because it's in this moment where Jesus cuts the tension fairly thick. And I'm going to fly through this. So you better buckle up, But I found some things in John 14:6, and you guys have heard this from the time you were knee-high to the grasshoppers. I am the way, the truth, and life. No one will come to the Father except through me. Yeah, I get that, Jesus. But what we may miss is the context by which this is said. If you followed our series at all, we're in this conversation called Camping with Christ, and the main question that we're asking, or the main thing that we're kind of saying, is that when you see who Jesus is, you know who you're called to be. When you see who Jesus is, you know who you're called to be, and that's really the whole premise. But in John 14, this is the 6th of 7, quote-unquote, I am statements in John. There are actually over 20 references to I am. Okay, there are over 50 references to truth in John. John, this is a big deal. All the other Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they mention truth, but not as much as John mentions truth. Truth is a significant thing in the Gospel. And we've learned that through this series, we've walked with Jesus with the very first I am that he really proclaimed publicly was at the feeding of the 5,000. It was about 6 months before he died. Today, in John chapter 14, we are 2 days, some people would even argue, depending on how you cut the hours before his crucifixion. It's culminated. And this is what he says to his disciples, John 14:6, as you know. But let's look at the setting. Let's see what's happening. In John chapter 13, if you look at the heading, what's your heading say? Jesus what? Loud and proud. Wow. What? One more time. Thank you. There's somebody. All right. Jesus washes the feet of the disciples. So we know that this is kind of an intimate moment. What you may not have known is that when Jesus is washing the feet of the disciples, this is actually the last Passover meal that Jesus will celebrate. And as he's in Passover with the guys, he says in basically John 13, he's been alluring and vaguely mentioning his death. He does this foot washing. And look at verse 12. He says, let's look at 13:12. When he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and he returns to his place. Do you understand what I've done for you? Can you imagine in that moment, Jesus has just gotten through washing your feet and then he asks you, do you know what I did? There's got to be some, Peter, this is your cue. Tell us, what did he do? You open your mouth here because you're really good at that. Then he says, you call me teacher and Lord, and rightfully so, because that's what I am. But now I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet so that you should wash one another's feet. I have set an example for you to do for others what I have done. I tell you the truth, there it is again, no servant is greater than his master, nor a messenger greater than the one who has sent him. And what's happening in this context, the context of the context, is that the disciples had just been arguing about who's the best and who's the worst. Okay? So he says, forget that nonsense. To be the best, you got to serve. To be the best, you got to be the worst. To be the first, you have to be the last. And he shows them this intimate time of foot washing. And then they go into communion and the Passover meal. And look at verse 21. He says, after he had said that, verse 18. I'm not referring to all of you. I know those that I have chosen, but this is to fulfill the scripture. He who shares my bread, I'm in chapter 13, verse 18, has lifted up his heel against me. And I'm telling you now before it happens so that when it does happen, you'll believe that I am he. I tell you the truth, whoever accepts me, or accepts anyone I send accepts me, and whoever accepts me accepts the ones who sent me. Verse 21, he says, after he said this is John writing, Jesus was troubled in spirit and says, I tell you the truth, one of you is going to betray me. This is a troubling proclamation. As he's looking around the table, after they had just shared communion, after they had just shared Passover, after he just washed everybody's feet, he said, one of you is going to betray me tonight. You think Jesus is a little anxious? And all of a sudden, the disciples start to stare at one another and they start to wonder inside, is it me? I think it's interesting that each one of them thought it could be them. Each one of them thought it could be them. You know what that means? Every one of us could have been the one that betrayed Jesus. Some of us do every day. We stand for something, or we say we stand for something, but yet we betray based on how we behave who he is. Simon, who's at the end of the table, because it was set up in a U shape, and they're all leaning on elbows. I believe that Simon's over here, and I believe that Jesus is here, and John is here, and Judas is here. And Peter nods to John, the one who Jesus loves, and he says, hey, ask him who it is. So John leans back, it says, and whispers to Jesus, "Who is it?" And Jesus has this intimate conversation with John. He says, "The one who I share my bread with is who it is." So he takes this bread and he gives some to Judas. And Judas takes the bread, eats it. It says that Satan entered his heart at that very moment. And then Jesus says publicly, "What you are about to do, go do quickly." The disciples thought that he had some business to take care of. And he did, just not the right type of business. Judas runs out of the room. And as he runs out of the room, Jesus says, "Now," did you see it? "Now the Son of Man can be glorified." Now the Son of Man is glorified. That's in verse 31. And what he was talking about was that he was going to be raised up. That's what glorified means, but he, I think, is referring to the cross. That Calvary song that Tim introduced us to today. Raised us up. He raised him up. Then he says in verse 33, "My children." This is the only time in John that you're going to find this phrase, "my children." It's the only time in the Gospel of John that it's there. However, John refers back to this statement, "my children," about 8 more times in his epistle. 1 John, he refers back to the children, "my little children." And the same compassion that he witnessed Jesus have for the disciples, he's now witnessing, or he's now sharing with his church. Look at what Jesus says. "Now the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him." Verse 32, "If God is glorified in him, God will glorify the Son in him, and will glorify him at once. My children, I will be with you only a little longer. You will look for me, and just as I told the Jews, so now I tell you, where I'm going, you cannot go. A new command I give you, love one another as I have loved you, so that you must love one another. By all this, men will know that you are my disciples if you love one another." And Peter goes, whoa, okay, yeah, that love thing, that's awesome, fantastic. Where are you going? What's this nonsense about you told the Jews that they couldn't follow you, but we can follow you, and now we can't follow you where you're going? Where are you going that we can't go? Because this is the same Peter that left everything at the shore with his dad. Peter says in verse 37, "Lord, why can't I follow you now? I will lay down my life for you." And Jesus says, "Before the cock-a-doodle-doo happens 3 times tomorrow, you will deny me 3 times, Peter." Peter's saying, "Over my dead body will I do that." Do you think the tensions are thick? Do you think it's a little hot in the room? Jesus has just said, one of you is going to betray me, one of you is going to deny me. They're a little anxious. Now we have the context for 14. "Do not let your hearts be troubled." We've seen this verse before. When we looked at John chapter 11 with the resurrection of Lazarus, it says that Jesus was troubled in spirit. It even said it back here in chapter 13, verse 21, what we just read, that Jesus was troubled in spirit. This happens 4 or 5 times through John. The same word for trouble is the same word that we found in John 5 with the healing of the lame man. And the waters are, what was he waiting on? The waters to stir. The word for trouble is to be anxious, is to be stirred. It's a raging sea that's happening inside. And Jesus says, "Do not be troubled." See, it's in the moments of trouble, it's in the most anxious of times that Jesus whispers truth to you. And he says, "Trust me." In fact, if you're reading NIV, it says, "Trust in God and trust also in me." Other versions don't use the word trust. It uses the word believe. Believe in God and believe in me. We will come through. What's about to happen to Jesus in 2 days and hours to time? He's about to be hung on the cross. This is the most anxious of anxiousness that he has in his life, and yet he's encouraging the disciples because they're worried that what he just said affects them personally. "What do you mean I can't follow you?" And then he says, "In my Father's house are many rooms." If you're reading King James Version, it says many mansions. If it were not so, I would not have told you. And what he does here, he says, "And if I go there to prepare a place for you, I'm going to come back so that we can all live happily ever after." What that's a reference to, if you want to write this in your margins, is the betrothal process for the Jewish world. Because it was very common for a man, once he was being married to a woman, to say to his betrothed, I'm leaving you for a while, but I'm going to go home, I'm going to get things ready, we're going to live right next to my mom and dad. I'm going to build a home for us. And when that home is finished, I'm going to come and I'm going to knock on your door. As I knock on your door, you answer that door and we will live together forever. This is the betrothal process that Jesus refers to. And they immediately connected the dots. We sometimes miss that because we're not Jewish. Then look at what he says in verse 4. You know the way to the place where I'm going. And I love Thomas. We saw Thomas 2 weeks ago. Thomas was the one, Didymus, twin. Thomas is the one that said, well, let's go down to Jerusalem and die with him too, I guess. Okay, you can go back and refer to that. But in this passage, when Jesus says, you know where we're going, you know where I'm going to go, Thomas is like, wait, did I miss the spot on the map? Have we been there before? What do you mean we've been there? What do you mean we know where we're going? See, one of the phrases that we hear with Thomas is that he's doubting. I think he's more of a realist. I think he asks the questions that no one in the audience or no one in the class wants to ask. I think he's the guy that says, time out. Where did we see this again? And then Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one will come to the Father except through me. See, I think that today's I am the truth. Not a truth, I am the truth. Is one of the most controversial, one of the most polarizing verses in all of the Bible. In your family, your friends, your work friends, they're wondering, do you really believe this? It's the most polarizing verse, and it cuts through one of the most tension-filled times in the Bible. Because it's in the worst of the troubling of times where the truth has the most calming effect. It's in the worst of the most troubling times where truth has its most calming effect. You know, in that moment where we broke down on the hill, I was freaking out inside. But I knew that we'd be okay. I knew that we'd be okay. I knew that tomorrow would come. I knew we'd find a way out of it. I just needed to be still and know that He's God, that He's got this. He's not surprised by it. Just say, all right, God, I trust you. Whatever you want to happen here, I'm good with. Even if that means physically you're going to redeem me, fantastic. If that means spiritually, awesome. If that means that eternally, that this is it physically for me, but eternally I get to be with you in paradise, I'm good. Because it's in the most troubling of times that the truth has its most calming effects. So church, which side of the truth are you on? Because there is truth. There is a north pole. There is a north axis. There is a north. It's not just how you feel. It's where you're at. For me, the biggest thing isn't that Jesus is so audacious to say there's only one way. The fact remains for me, the question that remains for me, the thing that makes me fall to my knees is that there even is a way. Why in the world would God send His Son on the cross for me? Why would He pay the penalty that I deserved, not that He deserved? Why would the innocent suffer so that the guilty can stand? Because He loves you. And He wants you home. He wants you to come. And He's telling you there's a truth. And I'm it. Are you going to follow me? Lord, I pray that if you're speaking to someone today, that they would have the courage and boldness to stand and to come and to talk. That we might be able to wrestle with this thing together. In Christ's name, amen. Why don't you go?
Unless I got myself together, I would watch me fall apart. And I can't let that happen again. 'Cause then you'll see my heart in the saddest state it's ever been. This is no place to try and live my life. Stop right there, that's exactly where I'll stay. See that line and never should have crossed it. Stop right there, I never should have said that. It's the very moment that I wish that I could take back. Stop right there. That's exactly where I lost it. Where I never should have crossed it. Stop right there. Where I never should have said that. It's the very moment that I wish that I could take back. Oh, sorry for the person I became. I'm sorry that it took so long for me to change. I'm ready to be sure I never become that way again. 'Cause who I am ain't who I've been. Who I am ain't who I've been. Who I am ain't who I've been. And who I am will take the second chance you gave me. Who I am ain't who I've been. 'Cause who I've been only ever made me. So sorry for the person I became. So sorry that it took so